about me.
All right. Well, Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom.
I obviously was not here last week, and I did not get a chance to listen. So, anybody have any highlights from last week? It's quiet. You had quite the portion.
Yeah, but I think we never got beyond the "I had a dream."
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Yes.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't mentioned at that time, was he?
Not by name.
We didn't make
Just
it
by
down
dream.
to the. We never even made it to marrying his wives. Or
Okay.
anything. We didn't get to
You didn't even make it to the very complicated family.
No.
That
no,
was-
It was just about the dream.
All right. Well, that is one of the exciting passages. So yeah. Well, maybe. So kind of what I want to talk about today is not necessarily like so specific to the passages necessarily, but kind of some themes that we see going on. Because actually this portion, so other than the Jacob wrestling with the Lord passage, which is fascinating and one that I really like, the rest of this portion is really not my favorite. And I would like that to go on record because people always tell me that every portion is my favorite.
Okay.
But I'm telling you, this one is not.
Have you taught this portion? You haven't taught this.
I don't think I've taught, because I looked back for some notes and I couldn't find any.
I don't recall you doing this portion.
So I don't think I've ever taught this portion, which
It's
is,
not your
It's soon to
favorite.
become your favorite.
That's why.
huh?
It's soon to become.
It's soon to become my favorite. I don't know about that. I did in my reading this week learn some things and have some perspectives that I thought were really interesting. So I maybe don't, I mean, it's not that I dislike it. It's just not my favorite.
Yeah.
You can imagine my embarrassment that I was so wrong without you.
Because you thought I was going to come in here and be like, this is the best portion of the whole Torah. No. Not so much. And I'll explain a little bit why that is. But really this portion has some really challenging things. Even the section of Jacob wrestling with an angel, the Lord, a mysterious man, whoever you believe him to be.
Yeshua!
I think there's a good argument that it is most likely Yeshua or some version of pre-incarnate Messiah. But it's interesting to read this is one where modern Jewish theology goes in some interesting directions because it's definitely one of the passages where it shows that Judaism is trying to separate itself from Christianity. I keep looking at
Yes,
this and it's
please.
like right in your face, so I'm gonna move that.
Well, is that kind of
Thank you.
revenge because Christianity wrongly separated itself from Judaism? Maybe not intentionally,
Well, so that's an interesting topic and one I like. So there's some different theories about we have solid records that Christianity separated itself from Judaism. But it's also, there are some different theories. It's not as clear, but that Judaism intentionally separated itself from Christianity as well. Because modern rabbinic Judaism that developed out of Pharisaic tradition, mostly, there are some that are like, no, it just developed as it was going along, because there's no direct. So in Christian history, we have direct decision of saying very clearly, church council stating we are separating intentionally from the Jewish calendar, from Jewish tradition. Terrible things church fathers have written. We don't see that on the rabbinic Judaism side, but we see very clearly that all of Christian theology is ignored almost. It's not, there's very little mention in any of the rabbinic writings about what's going on. They're not even to respond to it. And so many believe that the intentional lack of response is a response in and of itself, in the intentionality of developing in opposition or to separate itself from Christianity. And I think I haven't done a deep study in all of the areas, but in Jewish history and historical theology, there's not one of the main areas we see it is with passages like this, where historically there's not a problem with these different kind of manifestations or representations of the divine identity of God in the Old Testament. Things like the angel of the Lord, which we in our tradition understand as the Messiah, this pre-incarnate Yeshua. But even there's mentions of the Holy Spirit, like later on with Moses and the 70 elders, they're all under the power of the Holy Spirit, basically. So there's not, in historical Jewish tradition, there's not a problem with that. It becomes the more modern rabbinic traditions that find explanations for those that are in opposition because one of the arguments is that Christians worship three gods, or there's these different representations that can't all be God or whatever. So these are newer, relatively speaking, they're still quite old in our understanding, but it's not always been that way, is the point.
Did they see that it was a pre-incarnate Messiah?
I don't know that language really existed necessarily, but they see it. But the reality is that they didn't have an issue with seeing God manifesting in the physical, as a physical being in this. So I don't know that I just don't know that was the terminology that was being used.
Right.
But the concept would be the same.
What was the basic explanation or understanding in ancient Jewish thought of it? Specifically in the passage stated that God is wrestling with Jacob, but Hosea calls the wrestler an angel. I mean, what was the thought about how to reconcile that in ancient Jewish thinking?
I think it just comes down to like the scale of where you fall on the literal versus kind of allegory or representational. So I mean, regardless of it, whether it is a pre-incarnate Yeshua or an angel sent from God, in Jewish thought that's the same thing. You're still wrestling with God. If it's just an angel, not the angel of the Lord, it's still conceptually the same. They would argue conceptually the same as wrestling with God, because he was sent by God.
In this particular passage where Jacob wrestles with God, the fact that Jacob names that place Peniel, and it says, "For I've seen God face to face, and my life's been spared." So it's not like I've seen a man or I've seen an angel.
Right.
The understanding that Jacob had on who he was dealing with is very.
Yeah, his experience is that he dealt with God, and if you to get down in the, to parse out specifically, is it actually God? Is it something being sent by God? In some sense, to some, and maybe theologically doesn't necessarily matter. It's a little bit of splitting hairs in the conceptual sense,
Yeah, I've thought about both these topics quite a bit. Doesn't mean I have all the wisdom.
Right.
In terms of the development of Jewish theology, my impression is, as I've learned more how much of our faith in Yeshua and Messiah and all these things were very prevalent, or at least there was Jewish thought in the first century that would align with our understanding. But as you said, as our faith got separated from its Jewish foundation and became more Gentile-centric and in opposition to Judaism, and like you said, there's a lot of writings about wanting not to be known as Judaism or connected to the Jews. And then the violence of the church, quote church, throughout history towards the Jewish people. And so there's this intentionality, I think, of opposition both directions as a result of our faith separating itself from a Jewish root. at least some Jewish,
Yeah.
you know, a lot of different Judaisms, obviously.
Right, exactly.
And lots of different Christianity.
Exactly, yeah, there's
Yeah.
plural, there's
Christianity
there's
took a
diversity
while.
in
Lots
both.
of different Islams.
Plurality is maybe not the right
Yeah,
word, but diversity
exactly.
in both.
And then the whole thing, go ahead.
No, yeah, so I was gonna say, I mean, and also if you think about, also, I mean, what has begun, has become like the current rabbinic Jewish interpretation, instruction, lifestyle, whatever, has also developed largely while the Jewish people didn't have a homeland, right? And so a lot of this is also, like, we have to think about, like, a lot of Jewish tradition is also developed for preservation of the Jewish people. So you think about, you know, the Jews are, you know, the temple's destroyed in 70, the Jews are cast out of Israel for almost 2,000 years until 1948 when they get to come back. I mean, always a remnant, but whatever. But by and large, most of the Jewish population is scattered across the earth, right? How do you keep a national identity? And this is one of the incredible things about the Jewish people, is that they've been able to maintain a national identity while they don't have a nation. No, that doesn't happen. Like, there's no other people group. That's why we read about these ancient people groups that don't exist. Why? Because they lost their land and were scattered, and they just assimilated into other nations and other people groups, or they were killed. The Jewish people have always had an identity. And so if you think about being cast out and being in the diaspora and these traditions developing, and then you also have this tension with Christianity, and both groups of people are claiming the God of Israel as their God, it makes sense that tradition would develop in opposition, because because each is trying to say, we're serving this God and this is how we do it, but we're not that.
Exactly.
And that's not me. I'm not saying that was what should have happened. I don't think that I don't think that Judaism and Christianity were ever supposed to become two separate things. But it is what did happen historically. And so if we look at that, if the Jewish people, though many, when Yeshua was here, did follow him, and there have been Jewish people who follow Yeshua and maintain Jewish identity throughout history, no matter how small the number may have been. But if you have these, but if there's this tension that's created, and then we start to have a really Gentile dominant Christianity that is persecuting Jewish people, it makes sense that something would develop to create separation.
Emma, has there been historically, is there evidence of, in historical Christianity, of a remnant that correctly loved Israel, correctly loved Jewish people? Has there always been Christians that have correctly done it right, even though, like, the majority was developing anti-Semitistic ideas?
Yeah, there absolutely have been.
Yeah, there's writings where Christian leaders are complaining because there's believers that are practicing, say, like Shabbat.
Yeah.
Or any of the festivals.
Yeah.
And so they're addressing that, quote, problem.
Yeah. So there's some, and there's periods of time where it's hard to find very much of that, but it does seem there's always a remnant. And it's also like, it doesn't, things don't like spontaneously come back, right? So like, yes, especially, so the modern, so we tend to trace the modern Messianic movement back to the Jesus movement, basically, because modern Messianic Judaism was more or less reborn then. However, it had some traction, and what was before that called the Hebrew Christian movement goes back to some pretty solid numbers and pretty solid, like, organization even in different parts of the world back to the 1800s. And then even beyond that, but there's different times when it's more formalized and more, like more organized and things like that. But there's always been this remnant. But it's like, because people wouldn't have started trying to have this kind of whatever Messianic Jewish Hebrew Christian, whatever phrasing you want to put on it, like spontaneously. It wasn't like it would have completely gone away and then all of a sudden said, I think we should do this, like just out of nowhere. Like that doesn't really happen. So there's been some amount of it throughout history, and sometimes that's just a very small group, but then it has gained traction in the last couple hundred years. Yeah.
There's several rabbis, Hasidic rabbis, who, like in the late 1800s, there's two of them in Liechtenstein, and one was named Isaac, and they wanted to practice Judaism, Hasidic Judaism, with Yeshua as the Messiah, but they got a lot of flack. Well, some of them got flack from their own sheep, their own congregations. Some even got flack from Hebrew Jewish evangelical missionaries, because they believed, the missionaries believed that if you're a Jew and you become a believer in Jesus, then you're quit being a Jew and being a Christian, and didn't want you practicing those things.
Yeah. So as you know, I think there's a lot of persecution and opposition to groups that did practice different variations of Messianic Judaism. So oftentimes it was done quietly because it was going to be so opposed. So sometimes that also leads to it being harder. But we do have some record, yeah.
I'll put a plug in to this with this ministry that I'm involved in. They've got several books about these different rabbis and different ones like Aaron Polyak that wanted to establish Messianic Jewish communities in Israel and wanted to practice Judaism with Yeshua as their Messiah. And so it's published by Vine of David, which is a part of First Fruits of Zion. And there's these beautiful books that like I said, The Everlasting Jew, I think, is the one about Isaac Fleckenstein. And so I put a plug in those books early.
Yeah, it's good. I remember reading some biographies, some like very academic biographies actually, of some different rabbis and believers that throughout history. I can't remember what that book was called. I'd have to find it. But anyway, it's interesting. Okay, so let's see here. Where do we want to go? What time is it? Okay. So back to this Jacob wrestling with God. So really the path, like I said, kind of this portion is really interesting because it really is kind of it's kind of about Esau. Because the path, we start the portion with, Jacob is going, he's left Laban and they're traveling, his family. We learn that he's left and he's accumulated quite a bit of wealth, because even the gifts that he's planning to send to win some favor with Esau are quite extensive. So Jacob and Esau have both accumulated quite a lot of wealth, and Esau's got this big army and all these different things, and so both of them have seemed to have done pretty well. But Jacob is, and remember, like when Jacob last saw Esau, right? Like Jacob's being sent away so that Esau doesn't kill him for stealing, receiving,
Birthright.
Getting the birthright instead of whatever view you like to have. I don't think he stole it either, but however you want to view that story, the point is Jacob got it, Esau didn't, and Esau's not happy, and they send it, right? Rebecca sends him away so that Esau doesn't kill him, and so that's what he's lived with this whole time, which is quite a long time. And he now, he has all these wives and all these children, and and all this wealth, and now he's coming back, and he's like, if Esau's still holding a grudge, this is not going to go well. So he's, he kind of is coming back and there's some interesting perspectives about this too. And I'm not necessarily saying I agree, but some say that his deception continues, is that he's trying to play this, humble, repentant younger brother sending all these gifts, but then he's not going to go, and he kind of follows him to the land, but then he doesn't actually follow him to the land. And so those that see Jacob in a very deceptive light like to paint it in that picture. I don't know that I would go there. But anyway, but basically this portion, but this portion is we're going out to meet Esau. Jacob has this encounter with the Lord, and then they're gonna ultimately meet up, and we actually end the end of the portion is actually about Esau's genealogy, which is really interesting. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But I wanted to talk about some other things, but real quick on this, on Jacob wrestling with the Lord. So So we already mentioned, like, he does recognize that he is wrestling with the Lord. He names the place Peniel, which Pene is face and El is God. So the face, he's naming the place the face of God because it's where he encountered the Lord. And then that portion of the narrative ends with, because his hip is struck, that the people of Israel don't eat that part of an animal to this day.
Then?
Is that consistent? I mean, is that actually done, as in that part is not eaten?
Yeah. Kenny has talked about, so Kenny Dyer in New York, in Brooklyn. Do you live in Brooklyn? Yeah.
Yes.
He used to work for a kosher butcher, and he's talked about this, and it's actually like they would not, like, it was a much larger section of the animal that they wouldn't sell or wouldn't package, whatever, because of this tradition. So it is still carried out even to this day. So you can ask him about it sometime. Yeah.
Yeah, I read recently a couple. Some won't even touch that part. They'll cut that out and not use that. Others will be very meticulous and make sure they get all the sinew out of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
On a similar tradition, I mean, in the sense of a tradition that's not like technically Torah commanded, but is there also some period of the year where Jewish women go out and mourn for Jephthah's daughter? I mean, am I saying his name right?
I actually I just came across that. I think, yeah, I mean, I think traditionally there was. I don't know if there's still much practice with that today, but there was a tradition of that. But I don't know a whole lot about it beyond that. There's something.
So with Jacob wrestling with God, I love the setup of this, because Jacob goes and he prays to God, and he says to him, you know, the whole setup of why he has this encounter, he tells God, you know, you said return to your land and to your relatives, and I'll do good with you. And he even admits, we actually see a humility, which you don't normally see with this character, where it says, I'm unworthy of all the proofs of your mercy. I mean, for him to put it out there for the Lord that way, and all the dependability that you have shown to your servant, you know, so there's this like recognition of what's going on there. So he's posturing himself properly for this. And then it says, for with only my staff I cross over this Jordan, and now I've become two camps. Deliver me, please, from my brother's hand, from Esau's hand, for I'm afraid of him, and he'll come and strike me, the mothers with the children. You yourself, so again he's telling God, you're the one that told me to go back and do this.
Right.
You yourself said, I will most certainly do good with you, and will make your seed like the sand of the sea that cannot be counted because of its abundance. So, I mean, he's leaning in, once again, to the covenant promise, but he is kind of saying, you almost get the feeling like, Lord, if you hadn't told me to go back and see my brother,
right,
I'm not so sure I would have done this, you know. But he is, I feel like this wrestle with God, this encounter he had with the Lord, his prayer, his heart, his desperation, but his recognition of who he is and his role that he played in this set him up for this type of encounter with the Lord. And so I like that prayer. I mean, I think we kind of skip over the prayer part first and we go straight into the encounter.
Yeah, no, that's good.
But that positioning was super important, and you can see a maturity that had obviously come to Jacob to understand where he's at. Now, granted, right after that, you know, how he divides, let's send the maidservant and their kids first, and then you know, there's obviously a favoritism thing getting set up there, which I don't like.
Right, but he does come by it honestly. We're several generations into this favoritism at this point, so.
But no, I it's the Lord trying to bring family back together. Mm-hmm. And I think
I think that's significant, and I want to talk more about that in a second. But kind of along with what you said, it's like Jacob is kind of even before he wrestles, he's kind of wrestling, right? Mm-hmm. He's like, all right, Lord, you told me, and I'm doing it because you told me, but I don't know that I really want to do it, right? One of the significant outcomes of this story is that his name is changed, right? His name is changed from Jacob to Israel, which ultimately becomes how we refer to the entire nation. Yeah. And Israel means what?
He wrestles with God.
It means to wrestle or to struggle with God. Yeah. And so this entire group of people is named after this struggle. And so I was thinking about this passage, and I like this passage, and I've read a lot of different things about it, but mostly from a Christian perspective, probably. But so I was reading some other things, and I went back to Dennis Prager's commentary, and I kind of liked some of the general thoughts that he had about this idea is that it's interesting that there's this here and in many places in the Bible we see struggle with God, right? We see questions, we see doubts, we see I don't like how this is happening, I don't want to do this, and the Lord having to intervene in some way to help remind a person of what they're supposed to do and where they're supposed to go and who they are, and what God has said and all these different things. So struggling and questioning and with God is a common theme, right? And this is actually one of the things that is unique to and important about the Torah, about the Bible, because other ancient traditions, other pagan gods, you don't fight with them. If you don't do what they say, they kill you. Like, you don't get to disagree, or you don't get to question or doubt or whatever. And I like this is a question that Dennis Prager poses that I think is a good one. He says, why did God create humans with the capacity to think, reason, and challenge if he did not want or expect them to use those God-given abilities in general and with regard to him? So he's kind of posing this thought that part of the reason that we have these abilities to think and reason and question is so that we will question him. Rich at one point taught and would mention that, it's like God is not really afraid of being put on trial. Like we are able to question and to examine him and to seek for truth for ourselves. We're not expected to blindly accept.
Because bottom line, the Lord only wants volunteers.
Right.
He doesn't want robots.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And and so there has to be a process with that, and that's why it's like sometimes it's hard to. That's why I struggle when we judge or classify people based off of one event in their lives, because it's always a struggle, and the trajectory is what is important. In many cases, more so than specific events. Now, I'm not saying that like an event can't have consequences that are lifelong and they don't matter, but like, when we live in this cancel culture that's like somebody made one mistake, we're never listening to anything they say again, it's not really helpful, and we wouldn't have any history of the Lord if we looked at everybody that way, right? Like all of the patriarchs, all of the main figures in the Bible all have these moments that if we looked at that one moment, we're like, you're out. We're gonna go find someone else to be our example, right?
David would have been canceled.
David would have been canceled. So would Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and so would Moses, and so would like all of these things. And it doesn't excuse what they did, but we see their wrestle. We also see we see their own struggles when they've committed these sins or these mistakes and they've done these things. We see their wrestle with God and the process of restoration back, right? Mm-hmm. And that's part of one of the significances of the Torah as well, is it does provide a way back. It provides processes and ways of restoration and reconciliation, which is also different than any other ancient, like like I said, like that's what I like about Dennis Prager's commentaries. I don't necessarily always agree with all of his conclusions, but his thought process is always, like, and he's seeking to highlight throughout his commentaries that the God of Israel is categorically different than any other God that has ever existed. And those differences are very important. And even he talks about he even talks about the Torah, and like he thinks about the laws of the Torah fitting into 3 categories. He thinks about that they're to produce moral individuals, they're to bring holiness to our lives, and they're to preserve a Jewish national memory. And he talks about that national memory idea with the, like what we talked about with that they don't eat the part of the animal with that hip, and it's a remembrance part of it. And it's also the same thing of eating matzah at Passover, and there's different things that are commanded that preserve identity and memory, right? But then it's also like to help develop this certain type of these people that are highly moral and pursuing holiness. So, and also I found he shared a story also in his commentary, so Dennis Prager has been on the radio forever, right? And has had a lot of in various capacities. He's just been out there, and so he's had a lot of his radio shows have been like live call-in. People can call in and ask questions and things like that. So I don't know how long ago this was, but he puts this story in his commentary and talks about that he had a devout Muslim woman call his radio show one day, and she said, "Why are you not Muslim?" Which I think is an interesting question. But it kind of goes back to, I mean, I think, and there may have been more to the question that he didn't give all this background or whatever. But that's basically what she asked him. And his response to her is that because Israel means to struggle with God, and Islam means to submit to God. And he said, I would rather struggle than submit. And I'm like, that's very Jewish of you. How very Jewish of you, Dennis Prager. But hold on a second, let me finish this little story quick. So he says, and he was just bringing about this contrast that Muslims are not taught to struggle and to question with God. Mm-hmm. Jewish people, like there's the joke that 2 Jews, 3 opinions. You can't, like Jewish people are very opinionated, very strong in all kinds of things, and they're supposed to be that way. And it's this idea that questioning and doubting is not wrong, and having opinion, like whatever.
It shows relationship.
Exactly, and so and then he goes on to say that that Islam and Muslim does not teach to struggle, and he argues even that Christianity often doesn't teach this struggle as well. And so which is an interesting thing, and he even makes that, and he's like, and that's interesting because this is part of Christianity, and Christians love this story, right? That's why I was saying, I'm like, I really wanted to go and look at some of the Jewish perspectives on this, because Christians like to take this story and make it mean all kinds of things. And I'm not saying it doesn't necessarily, there's multiple layers, and I'm not saying we can't apply it in different ways. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that because he brings out the point too that it's amazing how many Christians don't know that Israel means to struggle with God. And there are parts of Christianity where you are kind of, it does feel as though there's more of this expectation of just accepting doctrine, accepting God is good, Jesus came to die for my sins, I live under grace, I have to accept that he's good and I can't question anything about it. I have been in Christian circles that have felt that way. And so all that to say, I think this questioning God, and like I said sometimes, and I talked to the Kefarim a couple times over the summer about how we view the Bible. And one of the things I have told them, I've probably said it here before, is that when I sit down to like study a passage of scripture, I feel like it's been I've done a good job, and it's been worthwhile if I come out at the end with more questions than when I started. Because there's so, and God is so infinite, and I think that's part of like we were saying, it's the relationship, right? The relationship building is is like, you have to have questions. You have to seek out different things that you don't know, and that doesn't always mean that you accept them initially. Sometimes you gotta work through it a bit, right? And but think about that even with people. Like, you meet someone new, and whether it's a friend or somebody you're gonna date or whatever, whatever the context is, you meet someone, like, you have those people that you kind of click with, and like, oh, this is really fun. But what do? You ask each other questions, right? Yeah. And sometimes you ask someone a question, they answer, and you're like, I'm not sure about that. I don't know what I think about that. We're gonna have to talk about that some more, right? It's like, if we're really supposed to have a relationship with the Lord, it would. Why would that be any different? Okay. So anyway, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it was mentioned earlier how there's different Christianities.
Sure.
I don't have any experience with Islam, so I don't know about the different sects. But you're right. My impression is you don't question God.
Right.
With Judaism, like my experience with a Chabad rabbi who teaches Torah to Gentiles, which is very exciting. I've enjoyed that for decades now. He teaches by asking questions.
Right.
He doesn't just keep making, he does, at points, make statements, but most of the way that he teaches is by asking questions.
Right.
And then back to Christianity, my experience is that there are some denominations or sects of Christianity that do wrestle with God.
Yes.
But the impression, and I can see how Dennis Prager, not knowing the experience with different sects, and that's a tendency that we do is if we're not really familiar with something.
Sure.
And I've done this many times in my life. I just come up with judgments based upon some little bit of data, not a whole lot of data. And maybe the data I'm familiar with is really an outlier. But like, I can't even speak to Islam since I haven't had experience with it. But you're right, the impression is this lack of questioning.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Faith was going to say something.
I was going to say, we even see in Yeshua that he struggled with God in the garden.
Yeah, for sure.
I just want to say a few, comments in defense of Jacob. Because I think we see the seeds of the false accusations against him right here, and even before, when even Isaac comes into agreement with Esau, and yes, your brother has taken away your blessing. When I think it's important to not change what God says about Jacob all the way through.
Right.
And even to the point, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. And if you really, each passage is showing Esau's character and why he could have had the greatest riches, but he consistently chose to move away from God. And then we see all of that developing into Islam,
right?
False God, and accusing Jacob to this day.
Right.
So that's why I always come into defense.
I know.
Of
Yes.
Jacob,
No. I don't like all of the
so
negative pointing, because it is. I mean, it is.
Or
and it's
Israel, I should say.
Yeah. Because it's there are lots of things about this very ancient text that our modern minds are like, hold on a minute, like, this is crazy, like, but it was a different world. And also, like you're saying, like, God said,
and those are God's ways.
God said, and
divinely chooses.
Yeah. And so, and he, like we always say, like, and it's still true, like, he's willing to continue to work and be faithful throughout the really messy situations that humans tend to create, right? But what he says is still going to happen. But he seems to be okay with the path being kind of messy. And he's kind of okay with it if people look at how things happen and go, I don't think that should have been that way, and God, he's kind of okay with us not being okay with how things happen.
But in his divine providence, I personally see, when he gives me that glimpse to see that there's no other way. It's a narrow path, and there's going to be affliction, and there's going to be struggle, and that we're proven through that, how we overcome.
Yeah.
Through him. So.
Yeah, and this is actually something that something else that stuck out to me. What you're saying is something else that was kind of highlighted to me as I was looking through this and through lots of the stories, and this is kind of a general statement over Genesis, but this is another one of the things that Dennis Prager brings out is that, I'll just read this quote from him. He says that Genesis is filled with people deceiving other people because Genesis describes the human condition. Only by acknowledging how bad the human condition is does one appreciate how necessary the rest of the Torah is. It provides the moral guidelines to solve the problem of the human condition. And so, he's pointing out the fact that humans are human, right? And like we were just saying, is that God God decided to partner with humanity to write his story on the earth and to bring his kingdom to the earth, knowing that humans have all these issues, right? And that humans do have the ability to reason and challenge, and sometimes the decision they make through those reasoning skills is the wrong decision. Sometimes that reason, in a corrupted way, can lead to being opposed to God, right? That's like you're saying, that's why we have this tension we still see the tension between Jacob and Esau, which there's some interesting, I'm going to get to in just a second. I want to make sure I don't run out of time to get to some things about Esau in a second. But there's this, but the Torah, and that's one of the beautiful things about the Torah, particularly as we move along and he starts giving more instruction, he's kind of like, okay, I want you guys to live this way. It's not, he doesn't give the law and he doesn't give instruction. He requires, how do I want to say this? He requires intentionality and self-discipline and self-control, but he doesn't give laws that require humans to not be humans. Does that make sense? All of the Torah is actually for humans to live in fullness. It's not them to not live as humans. Whereas it's almost like there's other, and I think in other ancient cultures you would see more of the expectation is that you wouldn't even be human. You would just, I don't know, you would just blindly follow, you would whatever. But the Torah, as it goes along here and as we continue, is so relational and it grows. We see the relationship growing, right? At this point, we only have limited encounters with the Lord. The Lord is really only revealing himself mostly to one person at a time, but eventually, that's going to grow. And so that relationship grows. The expectations grow with that as well. But like I said, the Lord is so kind. He provides a way back, Yeah.
Yeah, I was so surprised when I read Deuteronomy just a few years ago that he said, this is not too difficult for you.
Yeah.
And then John in his first epistle says the same thing, that to do God's laws are not too difficult. Mm-hmm. And I came from the mindset, yeah, the laws are too difficult. That's why they were canceled. Mm-hmm. And so, and that's the only purpose of the law, was to show us we couldn't keep them.
Yeah.
But this whole thing about struggling with them, I think is part of this element of it's not being too difficult to keep these, because part of what you just said, I hadn't thought of this before until you said it. Part of this, I think, part of the whole commandments has in its core this struggle with obeying them.
Yeah.
And so that's a good thing, a positive thing.
Yeah.
And so we can look at all the commandments of God as a positive thing, because even if we struggle with them, even if we could not, but we can do them. He wouldn't ask us to do.
Right.
He wouldn't ask anybody to do something they can't do.
Right.
If we choose. In the same way, this may, you might really question me when I say this, but same thing with Yeshua. He had a free will. Mm-hmm. He could choose whether to obey his father or not. And what's so amazing to me is that it wasn't the power of God that gave him the ability to choose. It was him having been given free will to choose. And to me, that heightens my appreciation for him even more, that he chose to obey his father. And to me, that's amazing, and I'm so thankful to him for having made those choices when he could have not. And
Yeah.
I don't believe he did it because he had the power of God in him any different than any of us. But he chose to receive that we all have the power to do. Obviously, I don't know any of us have, but God doesn't ask us to do something that we don't have the free will to actually obey it. In the same way that Yeshua called Israel's leaders to repentance, and the kingdom would come if they would repent. If they didn't have the ability to make Yeshua king of the Jews, he wouldn't have asked them to. He wouldn't have, it'd been silly to ask them to do something that they couldn't have the ability to choose. So it didn't have to, the story in the Gospels didn't have to happen the way it did. It could have happened different. The kingdom could have come to earth in the first century when Yeshua was calling them to repentance. But I know when I heard this a few years ago, my own mindset, I know it had to happen the way it played out, because that's the way it played out. And to even consider the possibility that it could have played out different kind of blew my mind.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and it's like, and even so, it's hard to know with Yeshua where the line is between his humanity and his divinity. And I'll just leave it at that. But
People like to debate that.
People like to debate that, and it's I mean, it's one of those. It's like, we just kind of can't wrap our minds around how an infinite God could become a man, and so there's always going to be question and wonder about that, and that's actually not a bad thing, and it's not a bad thing to wonder about that and to try to wrestle with that, right? But I just wanted to say this one thing is like, back to your point, it's like, I do think the Lord gives us the ability to, you're right, he gives us the ability to live as he's asked. Like you mentioned the passage in Deuteronomy that says this Torah is not too difficult for you. And then it also makes me think of James is like, or Jacob, whichever name you want to use for him. But he talks about when he talks about temptation and people say they're tempted by God, and it's like, God is not tempted by evil and he doesn't tempt people. But there is temptation. And so, but he gives a way out, and I think one of the ways he also does that I think is important for us to remember is he does that by giving us other people. Which is complicated sometimes, right? But like the Torah, you actually cannot keep the Torah alone. You can't. And no one person, we call Yeshua the living Torah, and he is the living word. But we individually can't keep the whole Torah. There's instructions for different groups of people. There's instructions that require things to be done together. So like, we are meant, so I say that to say, I think we are also meant to help each other live as the Torah requires, right? So we and I also say, I don't think life with Yeshua, I don't think Yeshua changes that. Yeshua lived his life in community. Yes, he had moments of solitude with the Lord, and we each need our time with the Lord, but we also need our time with friends. Because even that's why I think he's so distraught in the garden when they keep falling asleep. He's like, I'm at my most distressed. Can you not just stay awake and be with me? Right? Because that, I think we're made to want that. Like, if you think of your most distressing moments of your life, usually what's the one thing you don't want is to be alone. Even if you don't really want to talk to people, you usually want someone to just be present with you, right? Like, we're designed to be with people. And so I think we're designed to help one another, to have a relationship with the Lord and with each other, and to live as he's asked us to live. And I do think that Yeshua, I think his own life models that. He had close friends. He didn't just have people who were around him learning from him. They had true relationship. Like, he had friends. Faith.
Just in agreement with what Jim was articulating, and then what you said, a scripture comes to mind, which is, therefore, since we have such a great high priest, who's passed through the heavens, Yeshua, Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. This is the point. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but who was tested in all things as we are yet without sin.
Right.
And I think this is why we will cast our crowns, and we call him the rightful king, because he didn't just wave a magic wand and it happened. He literally had to endure the enemy and the struggles and everything that he endured, or else he didn't really earn the crown. And then, gosh, by his grace, he gives us his spirit so that we can also overcome every temptation. It's possible to do that.
Yeah, for sure.
I was just gonna add, I mean, what you were saying, that's why God said it himself, that it's not okay for Adam to be alone. It's not okay. And that's why he was a partner. It's not okay for us to be alone. We need to be together. Now, when it comes when Yeshua is our master, our teacher. And yes, he was a real human. He taught us that we as humans, we can do what he can. That's why he's like, I'm the way, guys. I'm showing you how to do things. Even though I have this greatest power right now, I'm like you. And you don't need to imagine that you need to have this greatest power, because I'm showing you what to do. So even people want to believe it or not, yes, he was a human being, just showing us how to live our lives and teaching us, look, I'm not doing wonders with anything. If I do my wonders, it's because the Holy Spirit has come upon me. You guys can do the same. It's just a teacher. But once again, even if people don't want to believe it, that's fine. But that's the truth. He was human.
He was, yeah.
And that's why he was hungry. That's why he was tired. That's why he rested. That's why he slept. He was a real human. Yeah,
for sure. And it's also like, so yeah, he lived by example, and then he left, and he's like, and I'm going to send you a helper. Right? He sends the Holy Spirit to help us. Like, he's so kind. Okay. We're going to keep moving, because I want to make sure we get to talk about a little bit about some of these other things. So as we continue, like, so we mentioned briefly earlier, so he continues on. Jacob very clearly shows that he has favorites, right? And the way that he lines up his family to go and meet Esau, but he does himself go ahead. So he is putting himself first. He's not hiding behind all of them. He could have been way at the back, right, with Rachel and Joseph, but he's not. He's at the front, and everybody else is. We still see the favoritism, which I said. Like, I'm not saying it's right, but he does come by it honestly. But we see the negative. So that's another one of the things that's just so real about the Bible, is that we see both, right? We see, like, the favoritism it's not a good thing. Really, the multiple wives also not a good thing, especially when they're sisters. Like, it's just, and this is why later on in the Torah, the Lord's like, maybe not. Let's not do that. But anyway, but he goes out, and Esau meets him, and embraces him, and so they have this great meeting. But as they continue on, and we find out that there's a daughter in the midst of all these boys, and then we have this. This is one of the things I don't like about this portion, is I don't like this story with Dina, however you want to pronounce her name, and how Simeon and Levi respond, and all of these. Like, it's rough, guys. I don't like this story. But again, it goes back. One of the things that helped me this time, I will say, Dennis Prager came to my rescue once again, a little bit with this. I mean, but I don't. I would. Okay. So one thing is that we don't have to understand that because this story is in the Bible means that God is okay with it. It's a record of something that happened. It doesn't ever say that God is like, yep, that was the right way for that to happen. We don't see that. And we see, I think, but it gives us, again, it's this record of this human condition. It's this response of these brothers, and they go and kill all these people. And you know, and then Jacob's response to them, and this is Genesis 34, verse 30. Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You've brought trouble on me, making me a stench among the inhabitants of the land, among the Canaanites and the Perizzites. But I am but a few men. If they'll gather around me and strike me, then I'll be destroyed, my household and I." And they're still seeking this justice for their sister. But so something that this type of thing, even to an extent, still happens, right? It's this honor, you know, this defending honor type of thing, and we see this in the violent, like, not, and again, we shouldn't categorize all of Islam the same, just like we can't categorize that all of Judaism, all Jews are the same and all Christians are the same. There are different aspects, and there are many Muslim people who are not violent and who are not seeking, you know, doing in the types of practices that we see the violent ones, right? So we shouldn't categorize all of them, because we don't want to, we should have distinctions everywhere if we're going to have distinctions, right? But like, we still see this playing out among some groups of people, you know, these just really strong responses to things like this. And so this is one of the points that Dennis Prager makes about the Torah too. He says the culture of honor or saving face through revenge killing still operates in much of the region near the Middle East to the present day. The Torah sought to replace it with God's values, including trial by courts of law before meting out penalties, and punishment of only the wrongdoer and not his entire clan, and punishment proportional to the crime. And so as we see, you know, as we get more into the Torah, we see like this wouldn't be allowed under God's law, right? But all that hasn't been given. So that's why it's important to remember where we are in the story when we look at this. And I still don't think God is condoning this in any way. But that's, you know, we see justice, God's justice being established through Torah later on, so that things like this do not happen at the hand of Israel. So, but yeah, so this is a challenging story. And then we go on and in chapter, oh, sorry, go ahead.
What part of the story bothers you? The whole thing, or just the way they went about it?
Kind of the whole thing. Like, this story of, you know, it seems that she's the only daughter of Jacob, and that she is, you know, much of the, so the Torah upholds women really well. And actually, the fact that her brothers responded so strongly, wanting justice for her, I like that they wanted justice for her. I don't like how they went about it. And I don't like the negotiation or I don't like the this is a passage where I see more objectification of her, because this happens and then he's like, oh, I want to marry her. And he's bargaining about marrying her and all of these things. And it seems like, it all feels really kind of unjust from the beginning, and then even the way that justice is served is kind of unjust. So I just don't really like that. And it's like, I'm not saying there shouldn't have been consequences for what they did to her, but killing all of the men because
of what one man did.
Yeah. Also doesn't seem just. So, yeah. And so I think it's just a hard one to swallow for me. Yeah.
Well, and we find that, that part is commented on, that obviously God did not find that just through the blessings that Jacob gives to his children, to where Simeon and Levi are rebuked.
Right.
A quick note, based on things that we've said in the past, Yeshua taught regularly through questions. So, I'm not sure if this is a good time for it, but would like to get your perspective before class ends at some point here. Because it seems to me, although I'm willing to be wrong, that Jacob was deceiving Esau, but it also felt to me to be very normal in the sense of self-preservation.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't seem like Esau has good motives when there's 400 men coming at Jacob, to where I do think that there was tremendous wisdom on Jacob's part to pacify him with the droves. But I think it's also wise to not actually go see his brother, because Esau could change his mind at any moment, and then you're vulnerable in your brother's territory, and you're toast. So, but how do you see that? Do you agree? How do you disagree about all of that?
So I think that, I think both. I think there's a bit of, I do think there's a power struggle. And there's also they're both kind of testing the waters of can I trust you? Can I not? We're brothers. We haven't seen each other. Jacob had to leave because we thought Esau was going to kill him. Does he still want to kill me? And, because it's not like they've been texting and planning this meetup, right? It's the ancient world. They just start going and they're going to see what happens when they run into one another. And I think Esau probably comes from the same thing. All right, I haven't seen my brother in forever. I don't really know, how he's going to come. So I'm going to take my army with me. I'm not going to pick a fight, but I'm going to be ready for a fight if it happens, So I think there's some of they have some history, and even if they're willing to greet one another peacefully, they both have memories. I think Dennis Prager says it's kind of like one of those they've decided to bury the hatchet, but they both remember where the hatchet is. So it's they're trying to move on, but they remember how they got to where they are. So I don't know that I don't tend to paint Jacob in the fully deceptive way that some do either, and even Dennis Prager tends to agree with the deception, but I don't as much, because I do think it's some self-preservation. I think that even practically speaking, these are both, Esau there's a large group of people and a lot of animals and a lot, there's a lot going on there, and Jacob has a lot of wealth. It doesn't seem like his numbers as far as people are as large, but we don't really know how many are traveling. We know it's his family, but they probably had other people. If they have that many animals and stuff, they've got other people traveling. There's other people, but we don't really know how many. But it seems and so it ultimately kind of ends up as the land is. It's similar, actually. It reminds me back even of Laban, and where do they part the land? And he's like, "You get the land," and Lot. Thank you. I'm like, it's not Laban.
Yeah.
I don't know why I couldn't come up with Lot. But Lot and Abraham, when it's the land can't support all of us, you pick your land. Well, God has already given Esau land. So really, this is another sense of where this is working out like it's supposed to. Jacob is supposed to stay in the land of Canaan because it's the land that God promised to him. And Esau's supposed to go to Edom because that's the land that was given to him. And so people like to paint this as a deceptive. I do think it's I actually think it's just more of a practical self-preservation. I think Jacob is yes, I'm going to follow you, because he's, like I said, he's not going to pick a fight if he doesn't have to, because Esau has clearly shown he has a way to win the fight. So I think that, I don't think it's outright deception. I actually think it's another way of they're getting to where they're supposed to be, and they're maintaining some level of relationship that's, they're not going to be constantly fighting and killing one another. Yeah.
Yeah, I think of that phrase, speak softly but carry a big stick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, but I'm wondering too about what happened between Isaac and Esau during this whole time that Jacob was gone.
Right.
I don't know if you know of any stories, but I wonder if Esau got what he wanted, that he was treated, because Jacob wasn't around, so he was treated like the firstborn. He still had the blessings and all these things that Jacob ended up ultimately having. But in terms of Esau's experience with his dad, with Jacob gone, I'm thinking he did pretty well. He was satisfied with that. He didn't care about the passing the blessing on through the covenant God made with Abraham. He he always showed he didn't care about that, but life was good and
Right.
everything, so why,
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, I don't know a lot about, we don't have a lot of, in this text, we don't have a lot of information. There probably are some traditional stories. I haven't looked into that. That would be really interesting. But it does seem that, at least in the family, there's at least enough, there's at a minimum a level of respect and honor. At the most, there would be, good relationship, because we see that, because when it gets to, at the end of chapter 35, in 28 and 29, we have a couple verses about Isaac's death. So now Isaac's days were 180 years. Then Isaac breathed his last and died, and was gathered to his people, old and full of days. So his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. So they are at least still getting along well enough that they go bury their father together. And Esau has honor for his, has respect, at the very least, has respect for his family, that he's doing that, right? And I think this is an area where we read what happens later back onto this text. So we always look at Esau as this terrible person. But in these stories, he's not really. I mean, yes, he seems to be angry. He doesn't really care about, this spiritual lineage and the promises and the birthright. But he does seem to care about his family, and he's really not being malicious, right? I think Dennis Prager calls him like a man of the earth or something. So he kind of, he doesn't seem to be overly spiritual. He's not looking for those things. He doesn't see the significance of it, but he's not a bad man. And I think that, the same, we know what's going to happen, right? We know that ultimately out of his line is going to develop are going to develop Israel's greatest enemies. But it doesn't start out that way. And I think, and this is something that, and Asher Intrader teaches about this and talks about this quite a bit, is they're still supposed to be, the older brother is still supposed to be part of the family. Right? And that's why it's such a big deal when we see any reconciliation between Arab Christians and Jews, Messianic Jews particularly. And when those moments happen and there can be friendship between Arab Christians and Jewish people at all, is a big deal, because it's actually everybody's supposed to be still supposed to be part of the family. Again, it goes on to this human condition and human reason, and things happen along the way that ultimately it does develop. And God knew that was going to happen, and God's willing to, but at the same time, he wants everybody to be part of the family. And the Lord is the Lord is revealing himself to Muslims and Arabs all the time in huge numbers. Yeah. It's going much better than it is with the Jewish people, honestly. So I think looking back on this, again, and we don't have a lot of information, but we also do have this. We end with the genealogy of Esau, and so he is part of the family, and his descendants are supposed to be part of the family. So we know, all of history, but I think we need to come back to, we need to be willing to let things kind of come full circle and come back to where they are part of the family, and want it to be better than this was, in some sense. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's just we want, we don't actually just want all those people to be annihilated. We want them to have revelation of Yeshua and the God of Israel, and come back into this alignment and this family, and be the older brother to Israel that they're supposed to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you're familiar with Joshua Aaron, the Messianic Jewish singer, he's been doing this neat thing where he sings, he represents English, and then they have a Messianic Jew, Israeli man that sings in Hebrew, and then they have an Arab Christian that sings in Arabic, and so it's kind of a fun thing. I might mention about Dennis Prager again. I'm pretty sure it's Dennis Prager, and a rabbi wrote a book that I read called The History of Anti-Semitism, Why the Jews, The History of Anti-Semitism. And so it's very good. I disagree. Well, what I disagree with what I think maybe our faith should look like within Christianity,
Right.
and his perspective on Christianity, but he might be right in terms of his experience. He's probably right with his experience about Christianity, but it is a very good book to understand.
Yeah.
I've got Dr. Michael Brown's book, They Have Blood in Their Hands, but
Our hands are stained
frankly,
with
I
blood.
haven't read it because I don't really want to be down.
It's really well written. It is a hard book to read, but it's really well done. I've read it a couple times.
Okay.
I think what I like about the Esau genealogy at the very end, of course it does comment that he married Canaanite women.
Right.
And we know the seed
Right.
could not come through the Canaanites.
Right.
It also says, though, that both of them were super prosperous.
Right.
And that the land could not sustain
Yeah.
this.
Right.
So now we've got Jacob back where he's supposed to be, and the fact that Esau went ahead and said, here, in a sense, I mean, he took his family and he moved. They didn't fight over
Right.
it. We didn't
Right.
have to have bargaining. He gave the land to his brother.
Right.
And so there's that, to me, there's something really beautiful in the
Mhm.
fact that this was not a strife
Right.
situation here.
Right. Yeah, the Lord the Lord actually, the Lord has actually taken care of the whole family, right?
Yeah.
Like the Lord gives everybody their place.
Yep.
And so to have some of the tensions that we have now is like, but actually he took care of everybody.
Yeah.
Everybody would just do what he said.
Yeah.
Everybody has enough, has their inheritance. Yeah.
Well, and in agreement with what you said, yes, ultimately Israel is to be the light of the world. The word of the very living God was given to them so that the rest of the world would walk in God's ways. So, for sure, out of every tribe, tongue, people, and nation, he desires that everyone would come in.
Yeah,
there will
for
be
sure.
a remnant.
Yeah.
And anyway, yeah, that ultimate beauty. I think, like you're bringing out, like these little portions of, oh, that's kind of close to kingdom. It's not quite there,
Right.
but that's kind of what we're talking about, like from God's point of view. That's kind of what I'm talking about. And ultimately, the fulfillment of all of that will be brothers willing in
Right.
unity.
Yeah.
Worshiping the same
Yeah.
God.
Yeah, that's good. All right, well, it's time. So, Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Thank you.